Welcome to Doc's Lab and our second Master Series. Welcome to Doc's Lab and our second Master Series. I do believe this is the 107th video in our second Master Series, the 56th video on basic processors, the 19th video on sculpting processors, and the third video on saturation. In this video, we are going to take a look at a couple different things. First of all, we are going to take a piece of audio and we're going to look at overdriving the actual channel itself to see what we get from that. Then we are going to look at possibly getting saturation from compressors and limiters. And lastly, we're going to look at things like console shapers. These were actually designed to emulate saturation that you can get from outboard gear and consoles when overdriving the actual electronic circuitry. So most of these do not emulate overdriving the speed capabilities of circuit. Most of them are set to emulate overdriving the amperage capabilities of the circuit, which works out to like drive or distortion that in light amounts can work as saturation. And you can buy different ones depending what your budget is, and sometimes they can be very nice. Sometimes they're a little problematic in a mix unless you want it on everything, so you can put it on a bus and things like that. But we're going to take a look at that because there are possibilities for doing saturation. I do recommend something like trash to be able to be very particular about what type of saturation you inject into your sound, which we'll be getting into in the next video, and adding noise with it to see what it does. But they can actually do a pretty good job once you familiarize yourself with them well and take the time to learn how to use them well on your productions. So stay tuned, give me just a minute, and let's look at saturation applied in these ways. Okay, so we're going to make this pretty quick, but first of all, that if you're going to run this off of some track, that sometimes like console shapers will be off of a bus, but whether or not that's off of a bus or you're running things like compressors or overdriving the track, you want to route that to its own separate bus, because when you start overdriving it, you want to be able to control it from the next link in the signal flow so you can bring the levels down to where you want them and possibly mix from that bus. So really keep that in mind. The next thing we wanted to talk about is just really simply, this is going to be a really quick video because basically it's pretty simple. You got off of like say your track or something like that, that as you start pushing the levels up, that there's a good chance that as you push those levels up just on the track itself, that if you push it and you push it too hard, that you're going to end up getting saturation. So on this, you can see the footprint of the saturation that it's getting from overdriving just the track itself. You can see it really getting a lot of stuff in the lower end and some mild saturation in the low end. Looks like a couple even and odd harmonics across there that you're going to want to map out. And there's a video on my channel about mapping harmonics. But you know how you do that, and from where, from the track here, what from the event or anything like that, keep in mind that we're using a tone generator on these things, and it might affect the sound differently. So different sounds, you may get a footprint of the type of saturation and distortion that overdriving these things produce, but on different sounds it might act differently because of the different harmonic content in them. So keep that in mind and understand you have to experiment with that. It might work really well on say a flute, and it might not work really well on the oboe you have, or it might work really well on a different oboe that's, you know, has a different sound envelope that's been processed differently if it's a sample or if it's a live one. It depends. So however you're overdriving that track, that as you overdrive that track, you're more likely going to get some saturation, whether you overdrive it on the on the envelope itself or the event itself, or if you overdrive the track, you're more likely going to be able to attain some saturation. Most of the time in the DAW, it's not really built most of the time to emulate hardware, so they're trying to avoid any of that analog warmth best they can, you know, unless that's like console shapers designed to try to help that. But you can overdrive the track and achieve some saturation. Sometimes you don't see it a lot on here, but like say on a guitar or a vocal, you might get some really good saturation. You're going to want to experiment with it, get out your spectrometer and get out your scope and look for footprints and listen to which sounds it works well on, which ones it doesn't in the DAW you're using. I have 4 or 5 different DAWs, so you know it works a little differently in each one. So overdriving the track is a possibility, and you will get some saturation out of that. You will definitely get some saturation coming out of the track if you overdrive it. And you could overdrive it again from the bus and run that bus to another bus if you want to even achieve more saturation. But you can get some light saturation, getting a lot of low-end rumble down here, but you can get some saturation out of it that way. So just keep that in mind. Now, if I want to do this with the compressor, that if I turn the tone generator up, I've got it about -14 here. I've got it sitting right about 0 dB. And if I turn on my compressor, I've got a pretty low ratio. If I crank it up to like 20:1, it's like a brick wall limiter with a lot more knobs to play with. So, and the expander's not going to work that differently. And the threshold's set at about 0, and I've got a really hard knee on it. And I've got it about 100% mixed with a fast attack and release. I can push up the gain if I want to help push the envelope. But when I start trying to crank this up into it, that you will start to see eventually I will start getting some saturation. Now this saturation looks more like harmonic work, but you got some even and odd harmonics that you will have to map out that's actually saturation. So whether or not I adjust it from the event or I adjust it from the actual channel to start achieving some of that, I can bring that back down and I can push it up from the channel itself up into it. Either that, or as I can, if I'm not getting any saturation that way, I can come into the actual envelope of the sound, push it up there, or push up the input gain on the compressor to start to try to achieve that saturation that I'm achieving from pushing up this tone generator. But you will see that on this tone generator, it's given a pretty, you know, a footprint that's pretty obvious of what the footprint is of that type of saturation. And like I said, it might act differently on different sounds, so you have to experiment around on which ones the compressor you have works well on. Yeah, it's like when people get outboard gear, one guy really likes this compressor, one guy really likes that compressor, one guy likes that compressor, because it adds a certain footprint of saturation when they start wanting to use it to add a little bit of saturation. Does that make sense? And it's pretty widespread harmonic saturation on here, not a lot of lower end, not a lot of non-harmonic distortion going on there or anything like that. So it's pretty clean saturation off this. So it's an excuse for you to buy more compressors, but you can experiment around with them and you'll have a lot better understanding of why people will buy different outboard compressors and really like certain ones because of the type of saturation it gives them. And they might be working with certain type of instruments that they like it. They know they work on a vocalist with this microphone, and it just adds that nice little bit of warmth in there to them. And yeah, runs through the compressor and compressor will be, oh yeah, all right, yeah, good to go. For them, you know, does that make sense? You got a lot more control of something like Trash 2 or some other plugins, but you know, it can add some of that. You just need to experiment with it. You need to make some sounds, sing, ah, you know, you pull out your VSTs or record your violins, your drums, you know, whatever instruments might be sounding that you're using, experiment with them to see what you're getting off of with a scope and a spectrometer, and really hear what it's doing as you push it to see what kind of saturation you're getting to where if you like it. And it should work about the same with any type of a limiter also. You should be able to push up into a limiter and attain some saturation. Most of the time, it's odd harmonics. Odd harmonics are going to be the predominant in there because it's overdriving the amperage capability. Normally, when you start compressing, it starts emulating that. So whether that's with a limiter, a maximizer, an expander, a compressor, doesn't matter. It should be predominantly odd harmonics. But in the software world, sometimes things don't work normally as you would think that them emulating electronic gear because of coding. How they've coded it can have drastic effects on what is produced. So you really need to experiment around to see what you're getting. Okay, so next we're going to take a look at the console shapers. Okay, so whenever we're dealing with console shapers, there are lots of them on the market and things that are similar to them. But they're basically, when we're talking about overdriving the amperage capabilities of circuit, that they're a pretty simple concept. Normally they're on a bus, so you might want to route that bus to another bus. Some of them you get as plugins and drag them onto a track, but you know, like I said before, you might want to route that track or that bus to another bus to control the levels from there once you achieve the saturation you want. But it's pretty simple. You know, I have this tone generator under, like we talked about. It can be very different with different instruments. Just the footprint that we get off it is pretty obvious. I've got the drive set at 0 right now, but I've got the tone generator cranked up quite a bit, and it's pretty obvious. You've got a lot of even and odd harmonics coming off of there, and it's a pretty obvious footprint that you're getting off of just a single sinusoid. That might change off a different envelope of sound, say like a violin, because not only is it going off the fundamental, it might also be saturating off other harmonics, so you get multiple different footprints off different harmonics. And that can be the same with compressors if you push them too hard, or limiters and things like that. So, but they're a simple thing. If you're really into it, you know, and you're not going to do something like Trash 2 that we're going to talk about in the next video, so we can really control what type of saturation, that you find buying a few different ones, you know, isn't unheard of, because you might use a combination of a couple different console shapers that gets the type of saturation that you want. Most of the time how they operate for the most part is you put them on a track, and as you push those tracks up that are routed to a certain bus, as they start to go up into the clipping, normally how they work, as they go up and start going into the red, that it starts acting like an analog console or electronic console, that it starts to distort, causing some saturation and extreme distortion if you push it too hard. That's supposed to be the concept of it acting, making your desk and your tracks act like, and your buses can act the same way as if they're analog gear that's going to get overdriven and cause saturation. But you just kind of experiment with them and where the different settings, what settings that it adds what kind of saturation, again, how it changes the footprint, so that you get a pretty good understanding whenever you're working with certain type of instruments, a trombone, say, or a guitar, or, you know, a vocalist or whatever, what kind of what kind of saturation you're getting with any certain console shaper. And then just take some experimentation. The problem is it's not really controllable, and and that's not always a real negative thing, because if you can find a really good combination, maybe you get a couple different console shapers that you work together that cause a really nice saturation for you as you put it on a bus, and you route all your violins to that bus with a console shaper on it. Then you push them all up a little bit, you know, and they get a nice little saturation. I mean, you know, with a couple different ones on there, it can be, you know, you can achieve it that way. Because for years that people achieved that just with desks. So, you know, using compressors and using console shapers and things like that, and overdriving your tracks, that you can achieve close to the type of saturations, things that they were getting, you know, back in the day when it was just analog gear. You know, the nice thing I say about something like Trash, you control it a lot better, you know, and other plugins that are similar to that. You know, but these are a great plugin for something like that, because once you get used to doing that, you do a group of violins or a group of whatever, or your vocalists, and they're routed to a bus that you have a console shaper on, or a couple different ones, maybe working in conjunction with a compressor on there that you're pushing a little bit, that will achieve a really nice saturation that you really like for your vocals or your instruments or your groups of instruments or subgroups and things like that. And so it is viable to get some saturation on it. You know, for me, it's, you know, I stay away from the analog gear, and this is very uncontrollable to me. But then again, for years they used it, and I don't know how many albums I listened to that I just love them. They sound great, but I'd imagine if I had got the chance to work on them, that they would have been a lot cleaner, and I'd have been a lot more surgical about where I added saturation and how I added saturation so I could achieve the best sound possible. But back then, you just didn't have no choice. You had 30 different outboard, you know, pieces of equipment to try to achieve all these saturations. Most of them didn't. You'd be lucky you get in a studio, you know, without, you know, and have one console, let alone 50 different ones, so you can mix and blend saturations to come up with a really nice sound. So, you know, they're great. They just take some experimentation. This is just a stock one in my DAW, but they're starting to come out, and, you know, some of them actually do pretty good. Just map out the envelope that you're getting with your saturation, you know, map out the harmonics come off and what they are. And then, you know, you might buy a couple of them, and you might come out with a really nice saturation that's just like you get used to use a certain compressor with your console shaper that gives it, you get genre oriented, because the more you diversify, the less chance that your setup is going to work with everything. So if you're really specific about your works, like you do reggae or something, that you might be able to work yourself out some type of certain type of compressor and a couple console shapers, or one console shaper that really you use to add a little bit of saturation, you know, in this type of work that you do, and, you know, really fine tune yourself depending how small of a niche you're getting into, that might work just fine for you. So you can keep that in mind when we're going through using trash too. You have a lot better understanding of the different types of saturations applied to different sounds. That way you have a much better understanding before you go out and spend a bunch of money and experiment way too much and waste too much time, you know, trying to go through this. But once we get through the other video, you may come back to this one and go, well, I need to go do that, and I need to start setting up on that on a bus, and I got my console shaper there on the track or on the bus for that subgroup, and that's what I do with my harmonies and my vocals. And, you know, the more you know, specific your niche is, the better chance that you can make something like that work, because, you know, the more diversified you are, you got 500 different compressors, 300 different console shapers, you know, 4 different DAWs trying to achieve certain types of saturation, you know, for the type of whatever you might be working on. And it's much better to have tools that you can really be really specific about just making it sound good in whatever situation or environment you might be working in. But the more specific you get, the more useful tools like this can be, and sometimes they can be very useful. You know, if I was just doing old-time rock and roll, that there's no doubt that I would probably have my DAW set up with a couple certain compressors, a couple different console shapers, and I wouldn't even fuss with it, because I know it sounds great, you know, and I can adjust it more or less, or if they want a little bit different sound, I can do a little bit different EQ work on it or something like that, you know, and dirty it up. I can even reduce bit depth or something to dirty it up or clean it up a little bit, you know, raise or lower the bit depth on that individual production, and, you know, things like that, and probably work really fine. I'd probably be, you know, I mean, I might, the way I am, I'd probably end up pulling out my other tools anyway, but it would probably come out and sound radio ready with no doubt about it, depending on how picky you are about your sound and having your footprint of, you know, how detailed you are about making it sound like you and putting your artistic stamp on it. So that doesn't always mean that just because somebody doesn't mean they're not as good of an engineer, but, you know, that does, I mean, at some point it's going to probably point to them being a better engineer, but that really depends, you know. I mean, sometimes, you know, it just, that's the sound they got, that's the sound they like, and it fly for years in the studio with certain bands that they just love it. I love the way that guy does his recording, and he records and does his processing very simply, and it sounds great. Uses these microphones, this compressor, this and bam, off they go. He get work till his day he's dead. So anyway, that's just something to keep in mind, especially when working with console shapers and things like that. Just take these things into consideration and experiment with them. You'll have a little bit better understanding of that when we get through the next video. It's going to be a lot longer, and we're going to be looking at a lot of different types of saturations on a lot of different types of sound and mixing them with noise, so you'll have a lot better idea if you come back to this and try to simplify for more genre oriented type of productions, or you're not needing that much work done on it. That would, you know, that comes with experience. You know, the better job you do at your captures and your equalization and spatialization and things like that, and the better performers you have, the less work you have to do on it. So, you know, the better you fine tune your production, the less processing you have to do, hopefully, most of the time. So I certainly hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.